Welcome to Left on Right, where we give the left-wing perspective on right-wing media. Today we have Rand Paul talking about the Trump tariffs. The thing that I find most confusing about the tariff debacle is that people are just accepting that the tariffs are legal. They are not. Tariffs are a tax. Congress has the sole power to tax. This is a core principle of our Constitution. Why are the American people accepting a new tax declared by one man? That is the core principle that should animate everyone in this discussion. If you dig into the weeds a bit more, there is the IEEPA law, which gives the president the power to regulate trade if he declares an emergency. So, what happened? Trump declared a fake emergency, and now we have to pay a new tax on every import. And the world economy is in chaos. But there was no real emergency. The fact that Congress even allowed that law to exist in the first place was deeply misguided. Who decides the definition of an emergency? As we can see in practice, the president can declare anything an emergency, and with a cowardly Congress, the fake emergency is not being challenged. Who knew that there was this poison pill deeply buried in our laws that could throw the world economy into chaos? I'm a big fan of history and have read a lot about the founding principles of American government. Rand Paul does a great job going over this history and explaining why Congress must act. Let's take a listen.
You know, there was an old-fashioned conservative principle that believed that less taxes were better than more taxes, that if you tax something, you got less of it, so that if you place a new tax on trade, you'll get less trade. There was also this idea that you didn't do taxation without representation. That idea goes not only back to our American Revolution, it goes back to the English Civil War as well. It goes back to probably Magna Carta. I mean, for hundreds of years, the English were arguing of the supremacy of Parliament, that Parliament would be able to have the power over the king. So when we were leading up to the Revolution, the cry from James Otis was, "Taxation without representation is tyranny."
I like Rand Paul's point here. I mean, one thing that's always really interesting about this government stuff is there really isn't anything new that's happening. Everything that we're seeing is really historically been seen before, and so the thing with taxes is that it's really bad for one person to be able to declare taxes. And one thing that Rand Paul doesn't really get into too much here, but is a key component, is that whoever has the ability to create taxes, that results in tons of corruption. And historically, even in the US, whoever was in charge of import taxes had immense power because they could get bribes effectively from people who didn't want to be subject to taxes, and the exact same thing is happening now. So that's one reason why one person shouldn't be able to impose taxes, and Rand Paul will get into more.
Jay, the words of James Otis, but they still ring true today. It should not come as a surprise that a country founded on a tax revolt, one person is not allowed to raise taxes. Our founding fathers saw this and said, no, we want to make sure that the authority of taxation begins not only in Congress, that it actually originates in the House, the body closest to the people. Our Constitution forbids taxes from being enacted without the approval of Congress. And yet here we are. An emergency has been declared, as the senator from Virginia remarked, everywhere. There's an emergency everywhere. Sounds like an emergency everywhere is really an emergency nowhere. But despite the constitutional restraints or constraints on executive power, Americans have now been ordered to pay higher taxes in the form of tariffs, but without the consent of Congress.
That is exactly right. That was a very good argument by Rand Paul. I totally agree. one thing that's been happening with all these tariffs is people have been saying, oh, we're slapping China with a tariff, but that is totally wrong. We are slapping Americans with a tariff. Any American who buys something from China is going to have to pay more. And the idea that we're slapping China with a tariff doesn't make any sense. We're slapping the American people who buy things from China with a tax. Congress has the power of the tax. Let's continue.
The tariffs we discussed today are global tariffs. Just about every country in the world is subjected to at least a 10% tariff, to say nothing of the dozens of countries whose imports will be taxed at a much higher rate. Congress didn't debate these tariffs. Congress didn't vote to enact these tariffs. The tariffs are simply imposed by presidential fiat, by proclamation. Government by one person assumes all power by asserting a so-called emergency is the antithesis of constitutional government.
One thing I also want to point out here, so the typical process of enacting tariffs includes feedback from different parties, and it's a bit of a slow process. Tariffs and taxes in general are a really powerful tool. It's one of the core powers of a government. And whenever you are wielding extreme power, like the ability to tax, things need to be done carefully. So, someone on the left, I'm not totally against the idea of tariffs, but the thing is, you need to be doing it strategically. Like, okay, we want to have more manufacturing in the US. I think many people generally like that idea. Well, we got to start acting on making that happen. We need a real plan to encourage there to be manufacturing in the US while we have these tariffs that will buy us a little bit of time. But Trump just comes in, bulldozing ahead, and enacts the tariffs with no plan. We need a plan to actually get manufacturing in this country, not just tariffs that are applied haphazardly to the whole world without a clear plan to invest back in our country in terms of manufacturing.
It was Montesquieu that our founding fathers looked to in setting up the separation of powers. And Montesquieu said that when you unite the power, the legislative power with the executive power in the body of one person, that no liberty can exist. They worried about this. They fretted about it. They worried about having too much power of the president, and so they severely constricted the power of the presidency. They said the president couldn't take us to war, only Congress could. They said the president couldn't spend money, only Congress could. They said the president couldn't tax people, only Congress could. These were the very bedrock, and still are the very bedrock of our constitutional principles, and yet people, particularly on my side, are looking away and saying, oh, whatever, we'll just let the president do whatever. Look, I supported President Trump. I still support President Trump on many things, but I'm not for a country run by emergencies.
Now this comes to an important point here, is what's happening with all the Republican members in Congress in terms of opposing these clearly unconstitutional taxes on the American people. I mean, you could say they're afraid, hard to say. Either way, they're abdicating their responsibility to have checks and balances in our government. And you can see checks and balances are a really good thing for making sure we don't break things. And the checks and balances aren't working because Congress is not stepping up to the plate to stop what is clearly an unconstitutional tax on the American people declared by one man.
Even if the person were doing what I wanted and it was, making every day my birthday, I would not be for that unless we deliberated upon that. There are constitutional processes that are incredibly important. The Constitution doesn't allow the President of the United States to be the sole decider. Even the President must abide by the proper limits of executive power. Thankfully, our Constitution does more than merely hope that our chief executive will remain within the confines of the Constitution. Our Constitution explicitly limits the power of the presidency. Our founders led a rebellion against a king precisely over this. They went to great lengths to circumscribe and limit the power of the presidency. Devoted as they were to the preservation of individual liberty, the founders divided power among three branches of government. But more importantly, those three branches were to check and balance each other to prevent one branch from accumulating too much power.
I totally agree with Rand Paul here, and yeah, the Constitution's really amazing document, and I mean, I think what's interesting is historically, you know, the U.S. Constitution was a response to the fact that the kings in England could have too much power, and all the same dynamics that played out with that are playing out here, where if one person has the ability to tax, you get all kinds of bad outcomes. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Rand Paul has something to say about emergencies, which I think was pretty interesting. I was saying, like, who defines what is an emergency? So now he talks a bit about that legislatively, what was going on and what's currently going on.
When the emergency powers were granted to the president in 1976, the Emergencies Act was meant to constrain the Republican. We were already worried about too many emergencies. Many on my side have actually co-sponsored bills that say emergencies should automatically end unless affirmatively approved by Congress. Many of those people now are looking the other way. They're looking the other way and say, well, it's our president now. I had a reform of the Emergencies Act under the previous president, a Democrat. I had the same bill under a Republican. This should not be a partisan issue.
I totally agree with Rand Paul here. I mean, it's kind of amazing that this, I guess he's basically saying people are aware that the ability to declare an emergency could be abused, and Congress could put some safeguards on that to make sure that it's not abused, but for whatever reason it hasn't gotten passed, and that is really just not a good thing for our country. So that is very unfortunate that we still have that.
The founders would not have expected the upper chamber, the Senate, to let the novel use of a statute traditionally used to sanction adversaries to become used for tariffs, to tax American people, and to let it go unchallenged. This is not constitutionalism. This is cowardice. Our system of government cannot work when Congress abdicates its legislative authority. Madison said we would pit ambition against ambition. But what if we have presidential ambition and we have congressional acquiescence? We have congressional timidity. We have congressional non-entity, choosing to become a non-entity and not participate. Do whatever you want. It's a recipe for disaster.
This is an interesting point that he makes that I don't quite understand exactly what's happening here, but Congress is, always really unpopular, and it's really just not exerting its right to power here, which is really bad for the country. Congress has that power for a reason.
Madison and those of the revolutionary generation would have expected members of Congress to jealously guard their authority from the imperial pretensions of the chief executive. To endorse governance by emergency rule is to fail to live up to what the Constitution demands of us.
Yep, totally agree with that. So now let's skip ahead a little bit.
Congress. Tariffs are taxes, plain and simple. Tariffs don't punish foreign governments, they punish American families. When we tax imports, we raise the price of everything from groceries to smartphones to washing machines to just about every conceivable product. Voters in the last election indicated they were fed up with high prices. Every time Americans went to the grocery store, they were reminded that inflation and putting food on their family's table was more difficult and left them with less money for other necessities. Many pundits say the 24 election hinged on promises to reduce inflation and lower taxes. Does it make any sense to impose a tax on imports that will make all Americans worse off? Shouldn't we learn from our success? We should.
And Rand Paul has a good point here that the end of the Biden administration, the key thing that people are upset about was rampant inflation and not having enough money. And now we just have a new tax imposed on the American people. So I agree with him here. I mean, granted, it's possible that there could be tax break passed in addition to this, but we're not really seeing that clearly. And another thing that he doesn't really mention, which is important, is that if you think about people with less money are spending most of their income buying things, and so people with less income are going to pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes based on these tariffs. So basically, people who have less money are going to be paying a larger percentage of taxes relative to before with these tariffs. And we're talking about helping the middle class, helping people without that much money. This is doing the opposite. We're increasing taxes on the middle class.
To ask ourselves a fundamental question: is trade good? Well, trade is simply capitalism. Trade never occurs unless you want a product more than you want your money. Has everybody made a trade, a voluntary trade, that you thought you were being ripped off? No, you buy stuff only because you think you're making a good deal.
Rand Paul gets into this discussion about if trade is good. And I think another thing that's been weird about this whole discussion is the fact that there is a trade imbalance with other countries was one of the justifications for there being an emergency, which doesn't make any sense, as he's saying. Like, if you're purchasing those things, that means you want them. He's not going to get into all this. The analysis is a little bit more complicated by the fact that on the societal level, we do want to have production of certain things within the country for national security purposes. And it's also a little bit debatable, like, people pay higher prices, but then other people have jobs, so, like, what's the right trade-off there in terms of how much more do you want to pay in order to get American-made goods? And that's a bit of a question mark. But I agree with the basic premise here that trade isn't inherently bad. I like this, I have a trade deficit with my barber, but that's not an emergency. So I like his point here.
Those who say that, oh no, we're being ripped off, it's a fallacy. It asserts that one of the parties must necessarily lose or be taken advantage of. The argument belies a fundamental misunderstanding of trade. By definition, every voluntary trade is mutually beneficial. Trade is good, and that isn't an opinion, it's a fact. For at least the last 50 years, as trade rises, so does wealth. And people say the middle class has gotten smaller, slightly, but only because they've moved to the upper class. These tariffs will make Americans poorer.
I generally agree with him here. I mean, the basic point is if goods are cheaper, then you can get more with your money. So that's why trade is beneficial. So I thought this was a great speech by Rand Paul. Politically, it'll be interesting to see how this all pans out. So basically what happened here is the Senate was voting on whether they should cancel the tariffs, essentially, and that ended up getting defeated for the most part, and one provision to get rid of the tariffs on Canada passed, but that'll get defeated on the House. But anyways, this just is such a rational, reasonable argument. I don't know, you don't need to be discussing all this other stuff. It makes sense that we might want to have some tariffs to help with manufacturing in this country, but it really needs to be done in a strategic and industry by industry basis, not just a broad-based arbitrary tariff on all these other countries. Another thing he doesn't get into here, which is also important, is is the US dollar the world's reserve currency? Are other countries going to trust that America is a reliable government that they can trust to put their money in? And if you have someone just arbitrarily putting taxes without a clear ask for other countries, then how can you trust the US? And that is one of the reasons that the tariffs got paused. So I hope that you all thought this was interesting. If you're someone more on the right wing side of things, I think there's a really strong argument here that canceling the tariffs is a bipartisan issue just based on the constitutionality, and you can see the Constitution was a way for a reason. All of our economy, the global economy, is in chaos right now because we have these tariffs declared by one man seemingly arbitrarily, and who knows what's going to happen. So I appreciate that Rand Paul gave the speech, and I thought it was very logical, and there's some really strong points in there. So thank you very much for listening to Left on Right. If you enjoyed this video, please thumbs up, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Thank you very much for listening.